Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Global Security. We're pleased to be here today at the Canadian Parliament to launch our Institute's latest report guarding the G7, countering Beijing's interference operations. We have seen across all G7 democracies systemic work by the Chinese government and the United Fronts Department to infiltrate, to influence public opinion, to engage in transnational oppression and all other forms of activities that the G7 should be working more closely together to counter. This report provides detailed chapters on all G7 countries showing similar patterns across the world of how the Chinese government tries to influence politics, influence public policy, and influence trade and economic interests on behalf of their interests, not on behalf of ours. So this report really calls for a more coordinated, measured approach by the G7 together. We do know, and we do write in the report, that it's a tumultuous time for the G7. We've seen a rupture with the United States under Donald Trump's presidency, but we still have to stay the course with some of our key economic and democratic allies to work to protect our democracies from Chinese foreign interference and influence. It's a major problem, and we're calling for stronger action from Canada, Italy, Japan, the UK, France, and Germany. So with that being said, I would now like to turn to my colleague Marie Lamensch, who will talk a bit about the research. Marie?
Bonjour. Hello. By comparing the tactics across different countries, our report really establishes a pattern of that appears across G7 democracies. But we must also mention that these tactics are also adaptive. They are long-term, and we see them in different sectors. It's a little bit like the ancient Chinese game Wai Qi. It takes place over a long time, it is adaptive, and the government basically takes its time. So we identified several recurring tactics in areas of foreign influence. First, elite cooptation. The cultivation of political, economic, and academic elites over time is something that is clearly seen in all G7 countries. These efforts often operate through access, prestige, ego, partnerships, business tie, and long-term relationship buildings. So in the report, you will find examples from the UK, for example, with the case of Christine Lee, who had close ties to senior politicians in the UK. In France, the case of, for example, former Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin or Laurent Fabius are well known in France. In Italy, we're seeing a lot more local politicians being targeted, especially through ego and promises of development. Second, we also go into friendship associations. We identified a wide range of Beijing-linked associations that are important channels of foreign influence. There are business groups, diaspora groups, student groups at universities, cultural and professional associations, and academic networks. We also go into transnational repression and police stations. Laura Harth did a very good article yesterday in the Globe and Mail. Third, we also look into the media. In Italy in particular, there are now close ties between Chinese media and Italian media, official memorandum of understanding. So that means that the deal provide Italian outlets with free, ready-to-publish Chinese content, overwhelmingly positive in tone and lacking editorial scrutiny. So basically, that is being used to basically change or influence the narrative on China. Something that we have discussed quite a lot in Canada is academic and research influence. We highlight several concerns around academic and research influence. The concern is mainly around strategic research partnerships, talent recruitment, Confucius Institutes, and institutional dependencies in sensitive sectors, meaning AI, quantum technology, biotechnology. The UK at the moment is particularly fragile because since Brexit, it relies a lot on foreign students to keep afloat and on partnerships, including with Chinese universities. In 2025 in Bordeaux, France, a senior mathematician at the University of Bordeaux, alongside colleagues from other French universities, was investigated for allegedly enabling access to restricted defense and aerospace-related research through collaborations with Chinese Chinese institutions. So this is a warning sign for Canada as well. Finally, we'll also look into business, economic, and research influence. For example, countries like Germany have long had close relationships with China and are very dependent on companies over there. So in the long term, many of these relationships obviously are legitimate and economically beneficial, but they can create vulnerabilities and political pressure points. So this pattern is why we call for better research scrutiny among G7's partners and stronger protection for democratic institutions and diasporic communities. I'm also happy to answer any questions in French if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And now I'd like to call the Honourable John McKay to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Marie. May I commend this report to everyone, especially in particular to my former colleagues, because these reports are dry and academic until you are one of the victims. And I dare say that many of my colleagues, my former colleagues, are in fact victims of political interference directly or indirectly. In my case, I got a surprise telephone call from the head of a group I belong to and of about an attempted hacking of my emails unsuccessfully. But while I was a member of parliament, the Chinese police stations were operative just outside of my riding, and we're influencing diaspora communities negatively, of course. And of course, because Canada in general and GTA in particular is about as multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial community as there exists on the face of the earth, the Chinese community writ large, or more particularly it was victimized, as was the political element of that community, by Chinese interference. So I commend this report to my colleagues, my former colleagues, and I want to take this opportunity as well to note that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is apparently, for the first time in 10 years, making a visit to Canada from China. As this is an opportunity for a reset of our relationships between Canada and China, I hope that both ministers will take the opportunity to operationalize that reset so that this level of interference ceases, that both countries have an expectation that the other country will not involve itself in the items that have outlined very capably by Maria and Kyle in their report. So I'm rather hoping that in the event that there is a press conference, that question will be put to both ministers to A, see whether it's been discussed, and B, to see whether there's been any commitments made on the issue of foreign interference by the Chinese government in the affairs of Canada. So thank you. Let me turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you, John. I would now like to ask our other press conference expert with us, Dan Stanton, who's a former official with CSIS and now runs a national security program at the University of Ottawa. Dan.
Thank you, Kyle. Of my 32 years at CSIS, most of it was in counterintelligence. And when I started, it was the Cold War. And the threat landscape was pretty simple. There were adversarial states that were trying to steal secrets, cultivate sources, and traitors. That shifted considerably over time with the demise of the Soviet Union satellites and the onset of cyber. And what a lot of these states have been doing subsequent to that is leaning more towards influence. Why steal secrets when you can get access to the people that are going to carry out your country's policy goals? So that's a shift we've seen in Canada over all domains, whether we're talking about China, Russia, Iran, or others. We had a commission of inquiry, the Hogue Inquiry, which singled out China as one of the main areas of influence, of threatening influence, interference in diaspora communities, and political interference in elections. A lot of Canadians for the first time learned the extent and how comprehensive this activity was. Canada's resetting the relationship with China, and I think that's good. They're resetting with others. But my only comment would be this should be done with eyes wide open. We learned with the Meng affair and the two Michael tragedy that Canada did not have a special relationship with China. We sometimes have these illusions that we have a certain leverage or we have a special understood relationship we could use. The reality is often a lot more blunter than that. We don't. So my advice would be, let's go ahead. Let's see what we can do in terms of getting the relationship on a good, useful footing for all sectors of Canada. But we must also keep in mind that we need to safeguard our national security and we need to protect the people most vulnerable, which is the Canadians in those diasporic communities.
Thank you, Dan. So in closing, I'd like to let you know that the report is available on the website of the Montreal Institute for Global Security, migsinstitute.org. And maybe just to end with two comments. One is we've been hearing about the need to have guardrails, to put guardrails up. If Canada is re-engaging with China, we have to have guardrails to protect our security, our economic interests, and protect our diaspora communities, as well as politicians who are targeted by China or have been in the past. So that's key. And the last measure, the proposal we make, is that we've seen, and the report outlines, how the sub-state level is particularly vulnerable to Chinese foreign interference, particularly at the provincial and municipal level. So we call for a more coordinated approach, intelligence sharing by federal authorities in all G7 countries with their local and municipal authorities, because that is the weakness and the blind spot that has to be corrected. With that being said, we are open to take any questions from journalists in the office, in the room, or from those following online.
So you touched on, obviously, the foreign minister's trip. I believe it's the 28th he'll be arriving. You guys are also sandwiched into some fairly sticky issues with India and their large delegation. Some comments the ambassador made to the Globe and Mail. There was one comment that sort of stuck out about how every embassy has sort of security agencies. So I just... With this being said, and kind of like you said, they're trying to reset almost both of these relationships at the same time. And we've had the Minister of Foreign Affairs say that there's sort of two tracks to take this. There's the sort of trade and relationship stuff, and then foreign interference. Is that, do you think that's an appropriate way to view it, as these are two separate issues, or do you think that they're kind of leaving one of those sort of to the wayside while they're focusing on the trade and the economic side?
I'm happy to make a few comments and I'll turn to others. It's totally understandable to want to engage in trade, particularly as we're dealing with CUSMA being renegotiated and tariffs from the Americans. We do have economic interests to expand. However, we cannot be blind. We cannot be naive. We're dealing with states that have murdered Canadian citizens, that have harassed Canadian citizens, states that have stolen some of their top intellectual property. I'm talking about the empty Nortel building down off Carling that was once the jewel of Canada's tech community that was stolen and ripped and now forms part of Huawei. So we cannot be naive. We have to look at things through a historical lens and realize that we have allies and that we can trust. We have allies that share our values and the rule of law and our democracies, and we have to, I would argue, it's okay to do trade, but let's not be naive and let's work more closely with our G7 allies. But perhaps someone else would like to make a comment. John?
It's a bit of a sophistry to talk about parallel tracks. There's no such thing as parallel tracks when you're dealing in trade or in business of any kind, and simultaneously all of your best intellectual property is just walking out the door by one means or another. Then what do parallel tracks actually mean? So I adopt the comments of my colleagues, which are saying you need to do this as eyes wide open, that the prevailing presumption will be that the government of China will continue on its ways of trying to walk out the door with as much property as it possibly can, intellectual and otherwise, that it will continue to try to interfere in our electoral process. It'll try to continue to capture elites. And you know, I would say this is kind of like a shot across the bows of university and college presidents. Beware of the people that you have in your labs and in your positions of influence because they have dual purpose. And that dual purpose is the secondary, or the primary purpose is really to see that that information returns to Beijing.
Yeah, just to comment on the all countries have intelligence officers and embassies, I can't resist. Actually, they don't. Most countries do not have security or intelligence services in it. I think it's possible to reset relationships and have trade with foreign states and maintain a certain, I guess you could say, sense of decorum. And there's always a lot of spying that goes on. There's a lot of interference that goes on. But when there's an egregious activity, such as the killing of Canadians and a lot of other criminal activities that was stage managed through a consulate, that's where we're dealing with a total shift in the relationship. And while I think we still need to move forward and get some trade arrangements, I do think the government needs to do a little bit more on communication. The Canadians need to understand that the government has not forgotten, one hopes, and the government is not going to hold countries to account for what they're doing. And so in all the hype about these trade arrangements and exchanges, somewhere along the line there should be someone in a leadership position saying, yes, we still know this and we're still dealing with it. Rather than the communities, and it's the communities I'm thinking of, Sikh communities, Persian communities, Russian communities, that we still have their best interests as Canadians, and we haven't forgotten. That old conundrum between human rights and world statecraft, we know usually it leans more towards statecraft than human rights, but we must make an effort to have some equilibrium here.
Thank you. And are there any other questions from anyone following online? Or
Do one more. I just on the point of safeguards and foreign interference, we've had, I think we're coming up on 2 years since Bill C-70. I think we're maybe a couple of months since they named the Foreign Interference or Influence Registry Commissioner, and now we have C-25 coming through, which seems to be a bit of a compliment to C-70. Do you see these as, I guess, actually, is this progress in, even if it's minor, that there are signs that the government is still taking these seriously, or we've heard that there's still a lot of loopholes, a lot of work needs to be done, especially with C-25 and the amount of donations and how those can go through third parties and the limits on there. Do you still see a lot of loopholes, or is this at progress in any form?
I'll make some comments and turn to my colleagues who no doubt will have something to offer here. I think it is positive that we have a commissioner now in position. Hasn't seen a lot in the public, but it's good to have someone with that responsibility. They're good to see legislation going through. Also, but there's an issue here is that we need resources to deal with this problem, and we're seeing budget cuts, 50%, including massive budget cuts from public security, Public Safety Canada. So one has to ask, where are we going to have the resources and the people to actually protect Canadians and guard against this? It's not just a legislative, that's a good start, but there has to be people and resources behind that. So that's what we're hoping, that the coordination with G7 countries, sharing intelligence, better OSINT training, but having people to do that has to be key. If security is primary for Canada, as we see ourselves being isolated, authoritarian countries aligning, pushing middle powers around, we have to get our house in order, and that starts with putting resources to deal with this problem. Anybody else would like? John?
Maybe Dan.
Dan? Sure.
I think it is good we have a registry. I was never a huge supporter of it, but I think symbolically it reflects the fact that the government is serious and following up on what was recommended by the Commission of Inquiry. Bill C-70 was a great initiative, and a number of measures that came out of it. One of it was it allowed CSIS to widen the ambit of disclosures. They were no longer disclosing just to government, disclosed to universities, private sector, and others. So that will provide a more holistic investigation that will also allow for better relationships between government and those entities. And there was also in it more, I guess you could say, prosecutorial endgames in terms of foreign interference. At least we have that now. There was no real hammer before. But I would hope that the government doesn't see the registry as, here, we've given you the registry, now we'll move on, because it isn't really, it's effective in terms of electoral interference. It certainly isn't going to do anything about the clandestine activities of a state like China. So half of it, I'd say, good sign, good symbolism here that the government's moving forward, but I think there still is a lot more we need to see in terms of concrete measures. I'd like to at least see a prosecution at some point for somebody involved in this type of activity, a Canadian enabler. That would convince me that the government as a whole is engaged.
I think we also have to not just talk about foreign interference during elections. One thing the report shows is the United Front work system. It plays out over the long term. It focuses on different sectors: media, academia, friendship association, diaspora groups. It's over different levels. So it's important to also raise awareness among Canadians about this, because most of the people, something we saw is that most of the time, universities are completely unaware of the tactics used, long-term tactics used by the United Front work system, by the actors, because it often appears very legitimate and it's completely legal, but it is happening through narrative influence and long-term relationships. So it's also not just about politics or about elections or about raising awareness among the government. We also have to tell university about this, about raising awareness among diaspora groups, because this is where it's also happening. It's very local. It's very people-to-people relations, and targeting egos, promising trips, promising local development. We saw this a lot in Germany. Very small cities suddenly getting a lot of funding, and in exchange of what? In the long term, they're going to be very dependent on Beijing, for example. So we saw this a lot in Italy, small town of Asti, very little, suddenly getting a special relationship with this huge city in China that is focused on AI, while this small city in Piedmont that produces wine, that's all they have. Why is this relationship happening? So this is also what we need to focus on, not just politics in Canada, not just Ottawa. We have to go wider. Thank you.
No, that's good.
Are there any other questions from journalists in the room or online?
I'll keep going, but because you said on the funding, it's outside of elections. I know this sounds like I'm bringing it back to elections, but Democracy Watch, at the committee on, I think it was PROC, suggested that there needs to be sort of stricter campaign funding rules, particularly outside of election periods, because you have things like third parties who can sort of spend and raise and bring in and move around money however they want up until either 2 months, I think, before a fixed date election or during the election period. Do you think that would be an effective way to sort of cut down on this? I know it's only one step, but just maybe making it stricter, how much they can spend when, particularly outside of elections.
So political financing, I'm not sure if, John, that might fall into your area of expertise.
Yeah, you would think it would, except that I ran 9 campaigns and I didn't spend very much money on any one of them. It seemed to work out. I am frankly of two minds on this. And I guess my first point would be that we are very small potatoes compared to what goes on in the United States as far as congressional and Senate elections are concerned. So put it in a context. The second thing is there is no doubt but that the Chinese government has targeted a number of ridings primarily with Chinese diaspora, large Chinese diaspora communities, where they think they can play a game, and there, I think you have to make one rule for everybody, but that's where you'll be looking to see where the problems are. The third comment I would make is with respect to local politics, which I think are far more vulnerable than provincial or federal politics, and there the influence is insidious, it's profound, and it in many instances runs completely contrary to the national interests and has no supervision whatsoever. So to bring it to a conclusion here, I tend to agree with Duff Conacher's observations. I would not, however, wish it to become so onerous as to make it extremely difficult to raise funds for necessary funds for elections. There is already in place quite a considerable array of restrictions. Going outside the writ period, I would say is an idea to be looked at. I'm not sure I'm convinced at this point.
Thank you,
John.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est ce qui m'a fait à cette conférence.
Merci beaucoup.